Okay, we're on page 237 in The Path of the Just, studying the quality of haughtiness and how to avoid different forms of haughtiness. And here in the fourth manifestation, he's talking about false humility, somebody who is presenting themselves in a way of humility, but really it's just a ploy to receive honor and recognition. Okay, so towards the bottom of 237, this type of haughty person will station himself in positions below those that are greatly inferior to him or lower than the derided people of society, for he plans to demonstrate thereby the ultimate degree of humility. He also will not desire any honorific title and will shun all praises, while his heart inwardly proclaims, there's no one as wise and as humble as me in the whole world. Okay, I don't imagine this is I was going to say, I don't imagine this is a very common type of personality flaw, but on some level, I guess it probably does exist in people to the degree that we might, we might present ourselves or, sort of show up in a social sense with the qualities and attributes of humility, when in fact it's really just to be recognized as being humble. Does that resonate with anybody? I don't know if this is something that people can think of like in their own lives or perceive.
So he is so arrogant, he believes he's dust and ashes.
Right. But I don't know if he believes it or if he wants people to think it about him. There's a famous story, most likely never happened, in one of the yeshivot, in one of the Musar yeshivas in Europe. They used to have yeshivas that were specifically focused on Musar, which is the department of the area of Torah, which is focused on learning about character development and character traits. Exactly what we're doing now. We're learning Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's book, The Path of the Just, is a classic Musar topic. So there were yeshivas that really specialized in Musar. And there was once a yeshiva student who came to the yeshiva, brand new guy, brand new kid in the yeshiva. And on one of the first days of the semester, he was sitting and studying one of his classic Musar works about humility. And he was shuckling back and forth. And he was saying over and over again, Ich bin a gornisht, ich bin a gornisht, ich bin a gornisht. I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody. Okay. And which was a common way of learning Musar. One of the common ways of learning this type of Torah is repeating it over and over again to get it deep within you, deep inside of you. So he's sitting here, ich bin a gornisht, I'm a nothing, I'm a nothing. And one of the older yeshiva students who'd been there for a while was quite offended, who does this guy think he is? So he comes over to this guy and he says, who do you think you are to call yourself a gornisht? You know how long you have to learn in this yeshiva before you could be a gornisht? Nobody gets it, or you're all on mute? Thanks, Les.
Funny, yeah, that's funny, yeah.
Okay, like being in the world or in the eyes of a Musar perspective, being a gornisht, meaning being a nobody, being a nothing, humbling yourself, is the highest level. So if you're arrogant if you think you're a nobody, because you're jumping ahead of where you really are, so to speak. Okay. But somebody like this cannot hide forever. Page 238. However, haughty people such as these who display false modesty, right? This guy's not really modest at all. He's just pretending or acting as if he's modest because he wants people to think of him as modest in his unquenchable thirst for recognition. So although they outwardly act as humble, so there'll be no shortage of stumbling blocks for this person through which their true haughtiness will unwittingly be revealed, like a tongue of flame that escapes through pottery shards that cover a fire. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what the analogy is over there, but the sages of blessed memory have in fact formulated an analogy for this type of person, saying this is analogous to a secured house that seemed to contain treasures, but actually was full of straw. The walls of the house had many crevices that the straw entered and filled. After a while, the straw was in those crevices. The straw that was in those crevices began protruding from them, so that it became visible from the outside. And then everyone knew that the house had all the while been full of straw. Okay. Basically, the analogy over here is just what we're talking about. You're building this house to make it look like it's housing treasures, that inside you have something of great wealth, of great worth, of great value, but in fact you have something very insignificant or valueless inside the house, which is straw. So too is the person who's out there in the world presenting themselves as having this quality of humility, when in fact they don't have it at all. So it is with the matter of haughty people who act humbly. They will be unable to always hide their true essence, and their evil intention will become recognizable through their haughty actions that slip through the cracks of their falsely humble veneer. Everyone will realize that in fact their ways are conducted with counterfeit humility and deceitful self-effacement. I think it's interesting, by the way, that he refers to arrogance, acting in a way of haughtiness, as evil intentions. In other words, this whole guy who's created this ruse, this scheme, this false portrayal of himself to appear in the eyes of the community at large to be a man of great humility, but in fact he's actually quite arrogant and quite conceited. That he refers to that type of scheme as an act of evil. One of the most important things, I think, in Judaism, and certainly when it comes to talking about midot and character traits, is to be real with who you are and to try to present yourself in the world in a way that's fair and accurate, as a fair and accurate portrayal of who you are or who you assess yourself to be on the inside, right? And we don't want to falsely portray ourselves as being overly humble, and we don't want to falsely portray ourselves as being overly wise and overly scholarly. Right? On each side, you don't want, if you're scholarly and you're wise, you shouldn't walk around arrogant in an arrogant manner, but you should be able to project to the world that you do have wisdom to share, and not falsely, not be overly or falsely portraying yourself in both directions. It's important to be real with who we are. We refer to that in Musar terminology as toho kebaro, that your inside and your outside are the same. So a person should know where they're holding, in all the areas of life, and act accordingly, and try to live in synchronicity with who they really are. And as they're growing and developing themselves spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, they should, their public portrayal should grow in a commensurate way as well. Does that make sense, or is that like a too kind of subtle or lofty of an idea?
I have a little bit of a question. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if a little bit of a question makes sense, but I understand the idea of humility, but how do you balance that, this idea of I'm nothing, and the wisdom that comes with thinking I'm nothing, with the idea that we're all created by Hashem and we are precious, our lives are precious, and we're here for a purpose, that we do have something, lofty that we are here for, some purpose to achieve.
Yeah, so that is a great question, and that balance is, in a sense, what the learning of Musar is all about. There's another famous cute story, which also probably never happened, but sometimes a story can be true even if it never happened. because the truth, the message is a message of truth. The story was that there was a certain tzaddik, and one of the ways you know that this story probably never happened is because you hear the story told about like 10 different people, right? So it's a great story, but attribute it to whoever you want to attribute to. The Chofetz Chaim or Rabbi Cyril Salanter, whoever, it doesn't matter. David Began, you can pick anyone you want. So the story was that this great person, this great tzaddik of a person, used to carry around in his pocket 2 messages to himself, note to self. One of them said, Anochi Ofar Ve'efer. It's what Abraham said in the book of Genesis. I'm nothing but dust and dirt and dust, right? I'm lowly, I'm nothing, I'm worthless. And on the other pocket, he carried a paper which said, Bishvili Nivra Olam, that the world was created for me, which is something that the Talmud says that every person should say to themselves, Bishvili Nivra Olam, that the world was created for me. And he had these 2 notes to self in his opposing pockets. And as he would go through his day and his different, activities, if he was feeling a little edge of haughtiness creep in, he would pull out the note that said, Anochi Ofar Ve'efer, I'm dirt and ashes, I'm a nobody, I'm a nothing. And he would review it, he would internalize it. And on the contrary, if he began to feel insecure or insignificant, or feeling that his actions were not making a difference, or that he didn't have any self-worth, he would pull out the other note to self and remind himself, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, that the entire world was created for me. So it's a balance that we have to go through all the time and recalibrate and readjust when necessary. So on one hand, Lori's point is so true, and like Rabbi Nachman from Breslov says that I forgot the quote exactly now, but what's the quote? Nani, what's the quote? You say it every day.
The day you were born was the day God decided that the world couldn't exist without you.
Oh, that's the one, right? And that's something you could say to yourself on your birthday. But the truth is that I would, go even further and say today is the day that Hashem decided that the world cannot exist without you. And the proof of that is that you woke up this morning, right? So if Hashem reinvested your soul into you this morning, after you deposited it in his hands last night, it means that there's something in this world today that you're supposed to achieve and accomplish and bring into this world. So on one hand, you're absolutely right, Lori, that like we have something special and godly and unique to contribute that nobody else has. And at the same time, we have to remember, who am I? I'm really just an extension of God's power in this world, as everything else is, right? So I think the key is to realize that to the degree that I am plugged into the infinite source of existence, then I have infinite ability and power to do anything and everything I want to do in this world and achieve and accomplish great things. So it's sort of like the doctor, right? A humble doctor, a God-fearing, well-developed, worked out doctor won't say, I'm a terrible surgeon, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't operate, he'll say, no, I was bestowed with this incredible gift from Hashem that he renews, that he gives me every single day. He allows me the ability to be his emissary or his ambassador, his shaliach in this world, to bring healing to other people. It's totally a gift from Hashem. Hashem is empowering me with right now. But at the same time, I do recognize that I am one of the best, if not the best, surgeons in my field, and I will have the confidence to perform the surgeries that I, because if a person, let's say a doctor, becomes too humble, he works too hard on humility, he might all of a sudden wake up one day and say, what am I doing? Cutting people open with a knife and rearranging their parts inside of them and then sewing them back up? That's crazy. I don't know. Who am I to do that? And he might squander this gift that he has to heal people and cure people. But if he has an understanding and awareness that he's being powered by Hashem with this gift right now at this moment, then he'll do his job, and he'll do it the very best he can, but he won't become arrogant in the process. So it's a balance, Lori. It's an ongoing, constant, struggle to get that right and to recalibrate that all the time. Yeah, Les.
I think maybe one way to simplify the explanation is that it all depends upon motive and purpose. That if our purpose if our purpose is to do God's will, and our motive is tied into our efforts to do God's will, part of that is to be realistic. If you're a really talented surgeon, to allow yourself to feel that, to know that, because it's tied into the decisions you make to do his will. The danger comes when the center is the individual ego, and where that gets connected, where motive becomes a projection of ego. And I think it's very difficult to discriminate the difference by just looking at somebody. It takes the person themselves to train to be very sensitive to what their ego actually is, because very often we are not so self-aware that we understand that ourselves, about ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, you made a few points there, but the motivation is really the key, right? And humility doesn't mean to think that I'm a nobody. It means to recognize the gift that Hashem gave me, but understand that it's a gift that Hashem gave me, and that gift, and I'm responsible to use it and to utilize it, and then also to be self-aware enough to be able to check in with myself and assess my own motivation and adjust it when necessary. Somebody once came to the Chafetz Chaim. This story probably did happen because it's attached to the Chafetz Chaim and it sounds realistic or plausible, and said to him, you wrote this book about Lashon Hara, and you basically scared us to death, that to realize how easy it is to speak negatively and what the consequences are of speaking negatively. So maybe the best thing I can do is to take a vow of silence and just not speak at all, because it's so easy to stumble in the area of negative, hurtful speech, and the consequences are devastating. So maybe the best thing for me to do is just to be silent. So the Chafetz Chaim said, let me give you a mushal, give you an analogy for that. But imagine if somebody came to you and said, look, times are very tight and I'm under a lot of financial stress. The burden is too much. Can I borrow a significant sum from you? $50,000. So it's not an easy thing for you to do. It's going to require you to, tighten up your own finances, but you realize this person is in serious need of your assistance. So you go ahead and you lend him the money, giving him $50,000 for the year. And then because of that, you have to adjust your own home economic financial situation. So you give him the money, put it in an envelope, seal it, and give it to him. And you come back a year later to have him pay you back. And what does he do? He takes the envelope out of his drawer, the exact same envelope that he gave you, that you gave him, and he's never opened it. And you open it up, and the $50,000 are there, and he gives it back to you. And he says, "Thank you so much." He says, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? I gave you that money. I lent you that money to use it, to do something, to invest in something, to set yourself up in some way, to be able to prepare a future for yourself. And what's going on?" He said, "Look, I was too scared. I didn't, the responsibility of having to pay back that money was too great for me. I didn't want to take the chance of losing it by investing it in anything. So I wanted to make sure I could give it back to you as is." The Chafetz Chaim said, Hashem gave us a mouth, a tongue, the power, the intellect, the ability to speak, because there's so much power in that. There's so much future in that. There's so much energy and positivity and potential in the ability to speak, to do good, to build worlds, to build universes, to inspire, to enlighten, to share wisdom, to whatever it is. And you can do that with your speech. That's why I gave you speech. You're afraid you're going to speak Lashon Hara and hurt people, so you silence yourself and don't speak at all, that's like taking the gift that I gave you and putting it in the envelope to return to me when I come to collect it. That's not why I gave you the gift of speech. So we have to understand that Hashem gave us these gifts and these talents and everything that we have for a reason, for a purpose, to use them, tikkun olam, to make the world a better place. And we have to, we're responsible to use them. We can't come up after 120 years and say, you know, Hashem, I was too scared to use that gift that you gave me. But when we use those gifts, we have to also use them with constant and consistent humility to recognize that it's not me. It's not me that create. I may have developed this talent. I may have worked hard and invested time and energy to take this gift and talent that you invested in me to develop it and bring it to the next level. But ultimately, it's not me. It's something that you gave to me and invested in me for this purpose. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just so I was intrigued by your comment about evil intention
Yeah.
and why he ties it. And so the footnote takes it in a very different direction, because it's saying that the midrash about the straw ties to Doeg and Achitophel, which basically is taking the idea of sort of like humble servants to a level of evilness.
Right.
So it's going off in a very different direction.
Doeg and Achitophel were scheming against David HaMelech, against King David, and Achitophel was David's trusted advisor and his Rabbi. So you're right there. It's not just false humility. It's false humility as part of a grand scheme of deception. And it could be that's when. Are you suggesting maybe that's when we would apply the notion of evil scheme, but not
Well, I think it's interesting. He picks that midrash of the straw, which I did take a quick peek, and it right after what he quotes, it goes and says the house of straw is like Doeg and Achitophel. So the midrash takes it there, and so he took it there.
Yeah.
To
so
take
maybe
this
that's
to a different level of evilness.
Yeah.
Than
so
we're
maybe
talking
maybe in a lesser situation where you're not doing this to scheme an evil plot to get some desired nefarious results, but you're just doing it because of your own lack of self-worth or self-esteem. And maybe then to call that evil is a stretch and going too far. It's just it's bad midot. It's unfortunate. It's not the way to be happy and successful in life. But evil would be reserved for a situation of like this.
Or he believes the former leads to the latter, that you're on a path that you're eventually going to do something in that scheme that rises to a level. I'm not sure, but that's the context that.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm really glad you followed that up. It's always read the footnotes. Okay, great. Okay, fine. The final and most subtle manifestation of haughtiness. Okay, in case we haven't refined this too much, we're going to put it in the sifter one more time. I like to use that analogy of the sifter because I really think that's what Nikios is all about. Nikios is the overall topic that we're studying, which is unfortunately translated as cleanliness, but really what it means is refinement. And if you think of flour, you have very coarse flour and you put it through a sifter and it becomes like a more refined flour, but there still could be some impurities in that flour, so you resift it again, and there's still there could still be some bran or chaff or something in the flour, so you sift it again. So Nikios is a process of sifting and resifting and resifting and refining and further refining our attributes and our qualities and our midah. So now he's going to put haughtiness one more time through the sifter and show you the most subtle form of haughtiness. Other haughty people can be found whose haughtiness remains buried in their hearts. Okay, sort of like what you were saying before, less that they may not even realize, they don't know, they're not self-aware enough to understand that they are haughty. They do not display it in action, but think to themselves that they actually are very wise people who comprehend things accurately, and that not many and that not many are as wise as they. Therefore, they pay no attention to the words of others, even when they fail to grasp something, for they think that whatever is difficult for them to fathom will surely not be easy for others. And when they do understand something, they assume that whatever their intellect demonstrates to them as correct is so clear and so obvious that they need not be concerned about the opinions of those who disagree with them, regardless of whether those who disagree are from earlier generations or from later ones. They never have any doubts about the veracity of their own logic. Raise your hand, of course, because of the early hour and the failure to apply makeup. Many of you have shut the cameras off on your Zoom calls. But if your camera is on, raise your hand. Thank you, Les. Your makeup looks beautiful. Raise your hand if you can relate to this. If you know, no names, don't mention anybody, but if you can think of somebody who fits into this category. Have any of you been to college before? Have any of you met a university professor in your lifetime? Okay. I'm doing this course right now on tour guiding. It's fascinating. It's so exciting. I love it. It's intellectually challenging. And right now we're in a segment on archaeology. And last night we had it's like it's been a 9-hour, actually 12-hour section, 12-hour course on the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the land of Israel and all the archaeological sites. And this professor, no one knows who my professor is, right? There's no way anyone can know who this professor is. Maybe I should pause the recording here for a second. I bet all of you who are watching this recording are so curious what I was just talking about, but you'll have to call me personally if you want to find out. But some people are so unbelievably arrogant and they're so sure that they are right, that they can't even entertain the possibility that anybody else could have an opinion half as valid as theirs, and therefore they're not even listening to what you're saying. At one point in this course, one of the professors said, there's a discrepancy between the biblical narrative and what contemporary archaeology, between the biblical narrative and what the ancient inscription of this particular event say, right? The biblical narrative said that so-and-so murdered these two kings, and the ancient inscription from that time said that somebody else murdered these two kings. And clearly, because there's a discrepancy, that proves that the biblical narrative is wrong. So I raised my hand. I'm like, excuse me, if there's a discrepancy, why does that prove the biblical narrative is wrong? Maybe this particular king, this Egyptian king who wrote the inscription, was bragging about killing Israelite kings that he never did, because that's what kings do. And that's what politicians do. They brag about things that they never did. Have you watched the news recently? I didn't say that because you have to be respectful in these situations. But, he went on to this whole, well, of course, if you understand the archaeological, and I'm like, whatever. He wasn't listening. But there's such a hubris and such an arrogance in some people that they can't even entertain the possibility of somebody having an opinion that differs from theirs, and they're not even listening. They don't even the words that you're saying aren't even entering. They don't even acknowledge that the fact that you're in their presence. Familiar with these type of people? Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
welcome to the world of contemporary politics.
Yes, of course. But usually with politicians, you're not like, you don't have a personal interaction with them where you like come out of that interaction feeling totally invisible. Like, did this guy even know that I was in the room? Right. But sometimes in your own life, you do interact with people like this. It might be a CEO in your company. It might be, somebody who, a teacher or a professor. It could be, any number of different types of people, but it's when you have those moments, it's very, not fun. So, what did I want to say here? One more thing. Yeah. So he points out a very interesting thing at the end. He says that they need not be concerned about the opinions of those who disagree with them. And he has a very interesting line over here, which really may not make that much sense unless you're familiar with the process, the halachic process of how decisions are arrived at in the halachic context, in the context of Jewish law. He says, regardless of regardless of whether those who disagree are from an earlier generations or from later ones. Okay, we have general rules of how we arrive at decisions when it comes to Jewish law. One of those rules is that there are eras in the development of halakha, of Jewish law, that for the most part are set in stone and completely distinct from one another. So for example, you have the Mishnah, the time of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the authors of anyone whose name shows up in the Mishnah was completed and redacted and edited and published in the year around the year 200 of the Common Era by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Anybody whose name appears in a Mishnah is referred to as a Tana. They're from the Tanaic period of halachic development. You don't have to remember this, it's not going to be on the final exam. The next stage, anyone whose name is mentioned later than that in the Talmud is called an Amora. Okay, now it's a clear rule that if you're an Amora, because you came in the later stage, you cannot argue with a Tana, period. You don't have the authority, you don't have the ability to argue with a Tana. If something that a Tana says doesn't make sense, it means you're misunderstanding something, and you've got to go back and review and understand that again. And then after the Amoraim, you have the period called the Gaonim, and then you have the period called the Rishonim, and then you have the period called the Acharonim. You have these different periods. If you're from the period of the Acharonim, which all contemporary rabbinical sources are, because Acharonim means the last period, you don't have the ability to argue with a Rishon. So if Rashi says something that you disagree with, I'm sorry, buddy, you misunderstood the Rashi, or you're lacking some knowledge. I remember once, oh my gosh, I'll never forget. I said to one of my teachers in yeshiva, I said, Rebbe, this Tosfos makes no sense. Tosfos are the Tosafists. They're the grandsons of Rashi. Their comments are written on the side of every page of Gemara. And he looked at me and he said, this Tosfos makes no sense. He said, this Tosfos makes perfect sense. It's just that your little pea brain can't grasp it. That's what he said to me, right? He was trying to teach me a lesson that worked. I remember to this day, 25 years later. So an arrogant person, it doesn't matter to him if this person came, from an earlier generation, later generation. I know more. I know more than everybody. I know more than the people who came before me. I know more than the earlier generation. I know more than the younger generation. Okay, that is a level of arrogance and hubris, intellectual arrogance, that it's subtle, but if a person is living with that, or if you have to live with a person who's suffering from that, there's no you're invisible. Your opinion, your viewpoints, your values, what you have to say mean nothing in the eyes of that person, and you know it, and you feel it, and you experience it when you're in that.
Rabbi,
Well, yeah.
question for you. In the fourth line on the page, they say they do not display it in action. So they're thinking this, it's in their mind, but it doesn't sound like this. It's the kind of people who are the college professor. It sounds more
so
college professor who would behave like everything is perfect, but he knows in his heart he's got all the answers.
So I thank you, Larry, because you just answered a question that was bothering me as I was reading all this, which is if the way I was describing this was correct, then why is this considered such a subtle manifestation of haughtiness? This seems like a pretty blatant manifestation of haughtiness. So everything I said is true, except for one part, one correction, based on what you just said, which is that all of this is going on only in his heart and his mind. He's not displaying it. This guy is not displaying this. It's just his own attitude And maybe if you're very attuned, you can detect it, but his own attitude is, he's not showing it, but he's thinking that there's nothing that this guy can teach me, right? As opposed to the in Pirkei Avot, Ezehu Chacham, who's the truly wise person, Halo made Mikol Adam, somebody who's willing to learn from anybody and everybody. That's the exact opposite. The exact opposite is an awareness and a recognition that every single person that you meet and come across and interact with in your lifetime has something they can teach you, right? As opposed to this person whose attitude is, nobody has anything that they could possibly teach me because I know everything.
The word
Of a
that
wise
comes to
person.
the word that comes to my mind is smugness. You know, it's the guy said, I got all the answers, but I'm not going to tell anybody, and I'm going to look like a team player. But it's
Yeah.
definitely it seems like smug is the
Mhm,
word that I'm reading through there.
mhm.
David, David,
Yeah.
there has to be maybe a term like selective haughtiness, because there are people who maybe aren't given the gifts that a lot of other people are given, but on an isolated topic, they show incredible haughtiness that they know everything. You know, and that where does that come from? Because you know they're a schlemiel, but in this particular area about who should be the starting first baseman in the All-Star game, they are so arrogant that they know everything.
Yeah, I guess you could say that there's such a thing as selective audience. There are areas, you know, that I feel like I know more than everybody else, you know, and I'm the biggest chacham in this area. And then then I recognize that it's limited because it's not, you know, there are other areas where I'm obviously not as aware or knowledgeable or so. Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's definitely element to that, but that's not total haughtiness, because if you're totally haughty, you think in every area you're ahead of everybody else. But by the way, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, but one thing that's always been clear to me, as long as I've been able to understand people, you know, I don't know when I started to be able to understand people, but from the time that I could understand people to some degree, it's always been clear to me that arrogance is more often than not, if not always, really a manifestation of insecurity. Right? And I think we all know that intuitively to be true. That if a person is secure and has self-esteem and feels good about themselves, you know, they don't need to portray themselves as being smarter and better and wiser and funnier or this or that than everybody else. It's just when they have an element of self-loathing and they can't come to grips with that, with their own personal inner world, that they need to present themselves to the world as haughty, even though, you know, really they're suffering from, plagued by low self-esteem. Less.
Yeah, it has to do with purpose again, motive and purpose. And when you can't determine what motive and purpose actually are by examining behavior, because putting yourself, the projection of your own ego in front of everything else, can look the same as simply wrapping yourself in your sense of what God's purpose is and spreading factual information. I think you said this more clearly before I jumped in.
No, it's I think we're all processing this the same way. I think we're all on the same page. You know what I want to do is I want to finish his summary of haughtiness, so that we can move on next week to the next topic, which is anger. I know that's not a very relevant topic, but we'll go through it quickly just in case. Okay. I'm on page 240 on the top. All these attitudes are outgrowths of haughtiness, which cause wise people to regress and make their minds foolish. Meaning they may indeed even be wise. They may in fact be quite scholarly or knowledgeable, and maybe they even are. But because of their haughtiness, it causes a certain degree of regression. it unbalances the heart of even the leading sages. Even the leading sages, even the greatest chachamim, even the greatest scholars and sages and leaders and teachers and whatever are can be thrown off by haughtiness. I would go even further and say that they're even oftentimes even more susceptible to it because they actually do have something to be haughty about. If a person is haughty about something, but they really don't have anything to be haughty about, no one really takes it that seriously. And certainly that of students who have insufficiently studied under a teacher who, although barely having opened their eyes to the depths of wisdom, already consider themselves equal to the wisest of wise men. About all of these manifestations of haughtiness, it is stated that Toevas Hashem kol giva lev. This is from Proverbs, from Mishlei, from King Solomon. Every haughty heart is an abomination to Hashem. And anyone who wants to reach the level of Nikius has to work on this and purge themselves of this. Haughtiness is not only abominable, but also misguided. Moreover, one should know and understand that haughtiness is nothing but sheer blindness to reality, in which a person's intellect does not perceive his deficiencies or recognize his inadequacies. For if a person could see things as they are, and he would recognize the truth, he would abandon and maintain a great distance from all these evil and perverse ways. We'll discuss this topic further with the help of heaven when we arrive at our discussion of the trait of humility. There's a whole section in the spoke about humility, which due to the great difficulty in attaining it was placed, in the words of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor, among the last, meaning in the order of the spiritual ladder of growth, humility comes towards the end, not because the order here is not of importance, the order here is of difficulty. So because humility is such a difficult trait to master, it's a ladder. So it gets, once you've mastered, what's the one that comes before humility? I think it's piety. Yeah. Once you've mastered piety, then you can move on to humility. So humility comes later, but in the meantime, we're discussing this concept of haughtiness and how it applies. And it's really something that, we need to really take an honest look at ourselves. And it's hard because if we're suffering from haughtiness, then as you just said, we're blind to reality. So it's almost impossible to see or to pick up on or to detect in yourself. Right. And by the way, we normally apply the concept of Aseh lecha rab u'knei lecha chaver. You should make sure to have for yourself a Rabbi, a teacher, a mentor, and acquire for yourself a friend so that you have objective people in your life who can call you out and call out your mishigas and tell you when you need to correct something or tweak something. But if a person is already struggling with haughtiness, then as soon as one of your friends or teachers or mentors points out something, you're going to dismiss it automatically. You're not going to be open to hearing any sort of critique or criticism. So it's one of the hardest cycles to break because of the fact that by nature of being haughty and arrogant, you're already very closed to input from other people. So it's a challenge, big challenge. Okay, I don't want to go on to the next topic just because it's a separate one. So if anyone has any questions or thoughts or anything, we can.
David, I have a
Yes.
thought. Haughtiness can lead to a thirst for power and put you above the law. I was thinking of, I don't know if I got my facts right, but Shlomo HaMelech, who was probably the wisest of all people, was told he could have 2 horses, and he got like 2,000 horses because he could. I mean, is that power leading to, haughtiness leading to, I can do whatever I want?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be very careful, obviously, when we talk about people on the stature, the greatness of Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, but it's, you know, the mistakes that he made, some of the mistakes that he made were because he felt, because of the level of wisdom that he had, that it was in a sense above the law, right? That you know, the Torah says don't altar besusim, that the king should not acquire too many horses. And Shlomo, because if he does, he might become haughty and arrogant. And Shlomo HaMelech said about himself, you know, I can have, that's not going to happen to me. I can have a lot of horses, and because it's not going to apply to me. And lo and behold, he had his horses, and he went back to Mitzrayim to take the horses, which he wasn't supposed to do. All these things happen when a person feels, you know, that for some reason they're above the law. The law doesn't apply to me. You see that a little bit here in Israel too, with certain groups and sectors where they sometimes tend to feel that they're above the law. The law doesn't apply to them. I'm not just talking about prime ministers. I'm talking about other people too, where they feel that, you know, that they're above the law. The law doesn't apply to me. You know, the law is written by people who, you know, are not where I'm at, not the type of person, not coming on the level that I'm at, and therefore it doesn't apply. And that's a problem. It's a big problem.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
so your comments about most arrogance and haughtiness really stemming from low self-esteem is very consistent with, you know, what I see and what I think and what I've read and whatnot. And I find it curious that the Ramchal doesn't discuss it from that perspective at all. And I'm wondering whether you think that's because there's something particular about our modern sensibilities that we suffer from low self-esteem, that in previous generations maybe there was true haughtiness, or
you know, you're bringing up something really interesting, which is that when you look in, I mean, like, if you go to Barnes and Nobles, right, in Deerfield, you make sure to put on a hard helmet.
right.
It's under construction because they're putting in a
No
pickleball.
books.
They're putting in a pickleball course there.
Right.
But you know, if you were to, back in the day, go to a Barnes and Noble and walk in there and go to the New York Times bestseller section, you'd see probably half the books there are on self-esteem in some form or another, right? And yet when you open up the Musar books, you know, whatever, Orchos Tzadikim or Mesil Yesharim or any of the Musar books that talk about Midos, Bituach Atzmi, self-esteem, as we call it in modern Hebrew, it doesn't show up. They're not in there. There's no section on self-esteem in any of the classic Musar works. So it does lead one to believe that low self-esteem is a malaise of our generation that may not have existed in such a prevalent way. And I would guess to say that I would go out on a limb and say it did not exist in nearly the same way as it does in our generation. Maybe because, you know, who had the time and the luxury? It's a luxury. To lack self-esteem is a luxury that our bubbies and zaydis, you know, didn't have the time for, as they were milking cows and washing their clothes on, you know, what are those things called? You know, that I was just like, it's a very first world problem, you know, to lack self-esteem. And it's just not something that was really, didn't seem to be an emotional, spiritual problem nearly to the degree that it is today. So it could be, maybe that's why the Ramchal doesn't bring that up, because maybe that just wasn't, you know, something that human beings really grappled with back then. But, you know, I'm just surmising, but it's an interesting point. You would think, it seems like to us, it seems like probably the most basic rule of arrogance is that it really comes from lack of self-esteem. And then the Ramchal never mentions that. So it is peculiar. All right. All right, great to see everybody. Whoever wants to join us tomorrow, same time for Yeshiva, 9 o'clock. We'll continue with Yeshiva learning, and otherwise see you all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Rabbi Vegan, do you have a second?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
a quick
Yeah, let me stop the
quick update on something.